All right, so today we'll talk about specifics of project management around ideas and guidance coming from project management body of knowledge, so-called PMBOK. Two topics we picked last time we were talking. That was, first of all, project documentation management. What does it mean? How to do it? Maybe some tooling advice from personal experience, and stakeholder management. So let's start. Let me see if I can share on the screen. Just a sample. I'll start with basically so-called commonly used artifacts. By the way, this is PMBOK 7th guide, 7th version guidelines for PMBOK. And this is just overview of commonly used artifacts. And just to elaborate, commonly used artifacts means it can be a document or some item that's produced as a result of project execution or preparation, and not all of them are necessarily to be stored within project documentation. First of all, let's understand how the project starts and where the documentation comes. So a lot of people don't understand the point of documentation around project management, and that's a big problem. Because keeping records, keeping all the details around project decisions, keeping all the information helps not only establish the project, but also to properly track it, properly measure the execution, and properly archive all the information for future use. So any successful or unsuccessful project is always knowledge that can be used for future projects. That's why keeping track of documentation is also useful for future use. Project documentation starts at the very beginning of the project. So people who are delaying documenting information to the last moment, they are making themselves a disservice. From PMBOK perspective, project is broken down into major stages such as project initiation, project planning, project execution, project monitoring, and closure. So these elements are sort of big groups that are defining big areas of the project. And project documentation starts from the very beginning. So when project starts, it starts with so-called project charter. Project charter is basically a document that authorizes the existence of the project. It's not necessarily done for all the projects, but it's a very good practice to have such a formal document to define what the future project is, how this will be achieved, known information about the project, known risks, and have an official confirmation from project sponsor or initiator to basically say, yes, you start this project. This is not necessary document, but it's very nice to have. And even if there is no requirement within organization to have such document, it's very practical to at least document this before starting the project. Let me show you an example. So here's an example document. And by the way, if you will have any questions, just stop me and I'll talk more about this specific. The project charter usually has project name, company where this project is executed, some other details around goal of the project, like name of a targeted product, targeted process, or targeted change that this project is changing and project is targeting. The project team that's proposed for the future project, the owners of the particular document, in this case project charter, and the details of the changes done to the project charter. Here you can see this under version control, and it's very useful to have version control for any document, such as when the document was changed, who did this, and what was the change nature. Within project charter, it's absolutely necessary to have not just the description of the project, but the purpose of the project. Here it says project charter purpose because it's a sample document, but in general, you need to have purpose of the project described here. Why this project is needed and why are we doing it at all. Executive overview, basically very high level, easy to grasp description of the proposed project. Maybe some breakdown of the goals if they are available, like description and objective of the goal. Possible deliverables, milestones, if again possible, if at least available at this point. It's not necessarily going to be known at the very beginning of the project. So it's nice to have, but not necessary. Scope of the project, also very important. If as soon as we know the scope of the project and we can put it in the charter, it's better to put it. If not, it will go into overall project management plan down the road. Also, it's not very common in mixed companies where project managers are not performing the full project management position, but cost management is possible to be documented within charter. All the information known about projects, such as assumptions, constraints, potential risks, all of this is documented again in project charter if available. Also important, project interdependencies. Personally, I have never had a chance to document such information. Mostly it was around assumptions and risks, and sometimes constraints, but otherwise nothing additional was documented in the conditions and controls within the project charter. Organizational impact, this is not very common from experience, but also if this is known before starting the project, it's good to document how the project and the changes within the project impact overall the organization. And it's important to document early potential future project plan elements, such as project scope, project risk management, so basically change management details, risk management details. Even if there is a potential for a plan, like early plan for risk management or change management, it's possible to document here. Not necessary, but very nice to have. Organizational chart is also important for the project. If you know early on who is participating in this project. Basically, overview of everything within the project goes into project charter before even the project started. This helps down the road with actual project planning. Resource requirements, again, it's very rarely known, but quite possible that organization is structured and has specific roles for specific projects, so it's possible to document resources early in the project charter. And it's not going to be specifically just people. It can be resources in terms of materials, in terms of some additional unallocated time attributed to some additional specialists. So that can be a very broad description of resource management. Like here, it's non-people resource requirements, workstations, office, meeting rooms, etc. Again, other project management details, project management plan details, such as communication planning, reporting details, cadence of the project meetings and artifacts produced. And details what would mean for project to be over, to reach its goals, and how to complete this project closure. So here, basically, what is expected, at least early on, to do when project is being completed. And any attachments also go inside project chart. So this is done very early, even before any project is started, preferably done along with project stakeholders, not stakeholders, but project initiator or project sponsor, since project management cannot always decide on project goals and project details very early on. And in the end, it's a very good idea and actually necessary as per PMBOK for project sponsor or initiator to sign off on this project charter. So project charter is basically something that gives life to the project. Is it clear so far? Should I have slower pace for description? How does this sound?
Yeah, it's good for me.
Okay.
I'm taking some notes and stuff. Yeah.
Andrea, are you going to send us this charter?
Yes, I'll send the links. It's available in the internet. It's some of the free samples available on the internet. So yeah, and I'll send overview of the proposed artifacts. Yep.
Probably just one question. So about the project chart, so all of those tables which you showed to us and explained about the structure, what to include, etc. So this should be prepared exactly in the tables how you shown.
Not necessary. It's just an example. I mean, there is no strict requirement how project charter will look.
Okay.
This is just a proposal and just some good visual approach to this. I use something similar, not necessarily exactly like this, but something similar. So document can look differently depending on which document system is used, like let's say Word document or Confluence page or SharePoint documents or some just plain text. Anything is possible as long as it delivers the information and can be shared. So that's...
Okay.
I have also a question. I'm not sure if it's a part of this topic or it will be part of our future topics, but currently, while working on projects, I encounter a challenge which is related to the decision making of, let's say, the project timelines and what you know when it's possible to go live with the project and so on. So basically, who's the decision if let's say we are in the corporate environment, we are not a like freelancer consultant, but we are part of a corporate team where we are, let's say, managing and coordinating a project. For example, the leadership says, I want this project live on 1st of December, let's say. And you speak to the people that the go live depends on, and they say, I cannot make it on 1st. So I would need, let's say, until end of the month of December to launch, to create that. So, and but the person on the leadership side says, no, we need, it's a must. So who's the final decision on that? Isn't it the project leader, the project manager?
That's a very good question. And depends really on what role project manager plays in the project. And this topic actually part of stakeholder management, because anybody, including sponsor of the project, is a stakeholder, and project sponsor is who's requesting this project to be done. So it's always possible that estimations coming from project sponsor are incorrect, specifically for timelines. And it's the job for project manager to, before even the project is started, if possible, of course, to properly, first of all, properly perform evaluation of scope of the project, time needed to be done for this project to be done. Of course, it's not always to be possible to have precise estimations before the project is started. So planning stage of the project involves specifically activities to properly evaluate and estimate time needed for the project to be completed. And in case project cannot be completed within these timelines, there is also need for risk management, change management planning ahead of time, basically helping project manager to either avoid or have a plan when timelines don't meet. And that includes actual communication with project leader and knowing who is the actual approver of the change. Like, let's say the project starts beginning of December, project needs to be finished by beginning of December, but team estimated that it cannot be done before end of December. So there is a need, documented need within project to know exactly who is decision maker for these changes. Like initial goal is beginning of December, but during the project planning, let's say, we discovered that it cannot be done sooner than end of December. So this needs to be documented, how to communicate this proposed change to the timelines, how to negotiate with stakeholders, including project sponsor. And I'll talk a bit more about on this later around stakeholder management. Basically, it's a very sensitive and big topic because it's going into psychology and communication, how to talk to people. So it's a bit later. I'll talk about it.
Thank you. Yeah.
But yeah, it's a very important thing because again, people have certain expectations and they don't always know everything, and they might have expectations set wrong. So they need to have project manager needs to work as a negotiator here to basically connect everyone together and get a common understanding and common agreement on key project elements. Okay.
And what is, can you explain the difference between project sponsor and project executive sponsor? And I don't know, when I hear that, I'm always confused because in the past I've had like my manager, let's say, as a sponsor of a project, but also the director of the same department is some kind of an executive sponsor, and there's another sponsor. So what's this sponsor about?
Well, usually there is direct sponsor of the project, usually one person or group of people. This means people who are asking the project manager or project management organization to do certain change, to execute certain project. So in that case, direct manager of the project manager, in this case, possibly a sponsor. And that would go into project charter and stakeholder management plan as a list of project sponsors. There could be a number of people listed as sponsors. In that case, it's necessary to have a way to have agreement between these sponsors when making decisions on the project. And executive sponsor is usually somebody who's asking the sponsor to execute certain change. So in that case, executive officer or executive manager is quite often the executive sponsor of the project, since when it's multi-layer organization, it's rarely just an ask of a certain manager of a department, let's say. So quite rare. It could be a direct sponsor, but never executive sponsor in that case. So yeah, executive sponsor is somebody who is not asking project manager directly to make this project, but still somebody who really wants to have it done. So it's one of the stakeholders, and stakeholder with high influence level on the project, and probably somebody who wants to have full visibility into initial project management, planning, and all the project execution changes and information being shared. So executive sponsor is equally important, but quite often not asking project manager directly to make this project, to make this change.
But is it related to any also financial aspect of a sponsorship of the project, or it's just in terms of?
No, sponsor doesn't mean in this sense as a financial aspect. It's more of a person who wants this project done, who is the requester of this change, essentially. Not necessarily owner of the budget or some person who can influence financial approvals, because quite often organization is requesting project has no control of the budget being allocated to the project. It can be a quite separate organization within overall structure. Sometimes it's person who is approving budget, of course, but in bigger organizations it's quite often not the case. So sponsor here, it's not a financial term, it's more of a person who is actively interested in having this project done. Any other questions? Okay, so let's continue a bit on what documents are commonly used. I'm intentionally skipping a lot of the lesser documents because a lot of them are good to have, but they're rarely used in smaller projects, especially. For instance, like project brief, project vision statement, business case. Business case is important actually, but it's less common than project charter. So business case is basically sort of a, here it's described as value proposition, but basically explanation of why this project is good, and potentially indicating profits or some other benefits that will happen if this project is executed. So let's say company will make such amount of money, or this change will enable certain positive changes within the company or within the client organization. So business case is usually done, I mean, it's often done by project manager, but based on information supplied by project sponsor. Could be some other side stakeholders involved, but project sponsor who is interested in the project might know why this project needs to happen, what will be the benefit for overall and customer and client of this project change. Let's go to the next. Also important, this is strictly sort of a technical project artifact site. So there are something called logs and registers, and they capture information around the project. Anything that's discovered early on and anything that's discovered during the project execution and while project being closed. So all the information is captured all the time. That's key bullet point from what I'm talking about. So logs and registers, all of them can be drafted early on. All of them can be captured, most of them, except for risk adjust, like the backlog or any other backlog. So they can be captured early on, even during initiation of the project, and especially during project planning stage. First one, assumptions log. Assumptions essentially mean what do we presume, and what is like a piece of information that first of all we know, that we believe to be true, and that it's impacting the project. We might not have any proof, or we don't really have any information to support this, but it's an assumption that either project manager has, or stakeholder, or even project sponsor has. And it's very important to capture this. And the important part of this assumption log is how this information is kept. Now I'm switching to sample project plan. It's a pretty big document. This one is project management plan, and I'll show how the information from this assumption log, from other registers or logs, is stored within project management plan document. And to iterate, a lot of people have misconception that project management plan is just a work breakdown, basically a list of tasks and a list of dates associated with these tasks. It's not true at all. Project management plan is collection of all the information we know about the plan and how to execute this plan to have a successful project execution. So I'll skip all of this information for now. I'll go back to it later. I'll go to the registers. Second. Actually, within Project Charter, there are some samples that we can use. So let's see. No, they're not useful. We'll just go back. Okay, here. So we have a list of tables. They're not very well organized here. Okay, I'll explain by word. So assumption log basically has a detail of what is the assumption, basically a full description of it. Also, when this assumption was recorded and who made this assumption, basically a person who made the statement. So in case we need to trace it back, we know whom to talk to, and also to know when this assumption was made. Issue log, it's not important during initial stages of the project. However, sometimes it happens. So I'm skipping this. Risk register. Risk register is basically all known risks around the project, like anything that's impacting project that is a potential risk, and that can possibly prevent us from successfully reaching the project goals. Stakeholder register is basically a list of everybody who has any impact on a project. They might be part of the project team, and project team is people directly involved in execution of the project. Or they can be people from executive team, from other organizations that have a stake within this project, essentially. Okay, any questions so far about logs and registers? I outlined the most important ones that are very commonly used. Any questions?
No.
Okay.
I have a question. So
go ahead.
How do you recommend, so for example, you're called today and let's say they tell you we have to start this project and we have to go live, let's say next month with this project. This is the goal, this is what. then in practical, like day-to-day life, there's so much communication going forward, like many meetings to schedule with different stakeholders that you could think of.
Mm-hmm.
Then deliverables that appear like every day, a new deliverable that's found that's needed, and so on, risks and so on. How do you recommend keeping track? Like in the beginning, you like sit down and you first write the project plan, the charter, I mean, and then you go to the project plan, and then you
Yep.
have an Excel to track the tasks like on a daily basis, like meetings,
Mm-hmm.
deliverables, or I mean, in more practical way, how do you recommend starting and then doing the day-to-day, adding the activities day-to-day to not forget and to have some accountability in front of the management?
So here how it works. First of all, when you start with project charter, you just outline framework of the project. You don't basically list what you want to do. Within project management plan, you have something called project communications plan. And that's basically something that talks about how often do you meet, what do you discuss during these meetings, also when do you do certain communications within the project, like informing executive sponsor, let's say, or informing your direct sponsor. How do you keep everybody engaged, like sending out regular status updates, let's say. You document this within a communication plan. And let me see if there's a good example here. Here. So you basically identify the roles of every stakeholder within the project and define what kind of communication each role requires, or maybe even individual. Like every individual might have a separate communication requirement. You define what information you want to share. And I want to make it straight that anything that you plan, you can always change later, because some things you don't know. Nobody knows everything during the plan, during project execution. So it's, while it's important to capture everything as early as possible, it's also equally important to continue introducing changes if there are some critical changes coming, including communication management. For keeping track of tasks, it's important to know breakdown of the milestones. Basically, when do you, let's say you have deliverables. You have deliverable coming at certain stage of the project. And to this, you can tie certain communication milestones. So basically knowing what to communicate and when to communicate and to whom you need to send out this communication. And whether you want to receive some feedback or response from stakeholders that you communicate this milestone information. And was your question around how do you do it from certain tooling perspective or in general?
Yeah, both, like general both. And the tools.
I can suggest certain tools. I mean, I've used, let's say, Microsoft Project for defining the milestones and defining tasks within the project, basically creating this work breakdown structure. And this work breakdown structure also included communication milestones and project delivery milestones. Basically, within Microsoft Project, it was possible to do so, to define separate blocks of separate jobs, let's say. And within each job, you could define what do you do and what it depends on, because you need to, let's say, meet certain criteria or do certain tasks before issuing communication or basically publishing this deliverable or sharing the deliverable with certain stakeholders. I used Microsoft Project to keep track of these tasks. Equally important is to have proper scheduling. Like I was using Outlook tasks and Outlook meetings, just to keep track of schedule. That's one way to do it. Another thing, if you heard, there is a tool called Rike. It's very convenient for keeping track of tasks. In fact, not even for personal reference, but also team reference. You can assign tasks to other team members and keep track of what is being done. I mean, it's not free, but it's one of the tools for personal use. I think free. You don't have to pay for personal use. So that's another tool.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'll check
Let
out
me,
the
let me see
project.
if they have a. Nah. And this Rike complies to various project management methodologies. So whatever is selected can be adjusted within a Rike. So this tool is fairly useful. There are literally dozens of other tools doing similar things. So it's just a proposal. It's not assistance to use specifically this one. So once you complete planning of the project, you can break down these tasks and capture them, let's say, within some project management, task management tool like Rike. Rike is pretty useful for this. So that's for using specific tools and how to plan specific tasks. So key is to always track what is being done and record it within convenient. I mean, some people use Excel just to track tasks, but that requires a lot more effort because you cannot set up Excel to remind you when next task is due. You have to manually review it. So using something like Outlook, or more specifically specialized tools like Rike, helps a lot more. These tools provide reminders, they keep track of dependencies, they keep track of team members that are executing certain tasks, because project team might be quite sizable, have a lot of people involved. So going back to communication plan and around stakeholder management, essentially you need to identify everybody who's impacting the project, and this list will continue growing. So to properly populate the list of stakeholders and everybody who's impacting the project, it's good to identify key stakeholders and people you think have idea who can be impacting the project, and have, let's say, one-on-one interview to talk who they think might impact the project. I mean, that's one way to do it. It's not necessary, just from personal experience, to have one-on-one interview and discuss with every crucial key holder who do they think might be also important for the stakeholder list of the project, like who has impact on the project. So interviews and discussions with the team are equally important to populate list of stakeholders and to basically refine communications plan for the project and for each stakeholder. Project management plan essentially has two sets of data, personally, I think. First is regular communications and regular meetings with certain cadence, certain schedule. You can capture it early on. I usually do it, let's say, have a project meeting, have a status update communication have, let's say, sponsor or executive sponsor meeting. And if there is such person or team, a customer meeting, basically customer facing meeting, the person who's on the receiving end of the project change. So these might be 3 key areas within regular meetings, regular communications. Second part is actual communication within the project team. How to keep people engaged, how to make sure everybody is on the same page for the changes being done, for the work being done. And engaging projects, very intense projects often require daily stand-ups, or even every few hours stand up with the project team to discuss and get aligned. Some projects require less frequent meetings, but there hasn't been a project where you don't need to talk to the whole team on a regular basis to basically align everything that's being done and ensure that everybody knows what's being done and how it's being done. So 2 crucial areas: regular meetings with all the stakeholders, depending on the group. It could be broken down into every separate stakeholder group, like sponsor, general stakeholder listing, and customers or people who are receiving the change, and the project team meetings or project team communications, because sometimes it's not possible or not feasible to have actual meetings, but to communicate, let's say, through email, it's equally important. And going back to document management, all of the things that are being communicated, that are being discussed, they should be captured. In huge projects and projects that involve a lot of people, there's even a separate role for a person who's keeping track of all the communication and all the meeting notes and everything. In most of the projects, it's usually on the shoulders of project manager to perform this task, to capture all the information and to store it. Personally, I've used several documentation systems. Most convenient one was Confluence, but essentially it requires using Confluence strictly for all the information sharing, and also SharePoint and all the Microsoft Office suite documentation. So essentially having a storage place for documents and organized way to access it for the whole team and all the relevant stakeholders is necessary. I haven't used any other specialized systems. I'm sure there are such systems, but for the purposes of most projects, anything similar to system based on SharePoint or with Microsoft Office embedded, and something with Confluence to have track of wiki changes is sufficient, in my opinion. But could be different in your case, because tooling is basically dependent on how comfortable you are with the specific tool, specific software, and how relevant it is to the tasks at hand. So just some explanation from my personal experience. Okay, going back to the documents again. I can do an overview of commonly used plans. Basically, project management plan includes all those separate plan areas. Do you want me to talk about this?
Yeah.
Yeah, sounds good. Unfortunately, I need to go in the training because they send me that I need to make a training.
I can stop from. I mean, I can continue with Didier if you have time. And since this is being recorded, I'll just share later.
Yes.
Link.
Yes. Just share it me, and I will listen.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you so much. Appreciate everything.
Thank you, Sylvia.
We did.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye. Bye for now.
Bye bye.
Okay. So do you want to talk about the plans, or you want to focus more on stakeholder management and this communications?
So what's more left on the plans?
I was going to talk about a list of the areas of the project management plan. What do they mean? And they're not going to be necessarily relevant to the work being done, but it's good to know what.
Yeah, let's talk about them.
Yeah,
then,
it's pretty easy to go through. It's not a huge list. So first one on the list is change control plan, and this is important basically to know how to implement the changes. Since project is a change, any project is a change, and you need to know how to implement these changes. And that doesn't mean the changes just to the certain product or some process, but also change to the project itself. So changes to the project documentation, changes to the project goals, changes to the risk register, to all the logs. This needs to be captured within change control plan. Basically, to have agreement, as you mentioned, if there is expectation of executive sponsor to have, going back, to have project done by early December, and in the end we estimate that it's not possible to have project completed before end of December, then this needs to go into change control plan that has to be confirmed by all the stakeholders, including sponsor, that yes, they agree this way. Like let's say it can be a change committee where a group of people gathers and votes on certain change, or it can be just in a form of conversation where project manager states proposed change and people say yes, we agree, or no, we don't. So it could be a number of approaches, but it's very important to have agreement how this change will be captured and implemented. Communications management plan, that's what I talked about, basically how to communicate information around the project, as well as how to address individual stakeholders and how to share the information with the stakeholders, get the information from the stakeholders. Cost management plan is relevant when there is a budget and when there is cost. I mean, every project has a cost, but not always project manager has control over it. So this cost management is important when there is a way for project manager to influence cost of the project, and when it's one of the goals, equally important. Iteration plan is relevant when the project is being executed in iterations, such as agile approach, for instance. A procurement management plan, it's also relevant when you need to procure certain goods, certain materials for the project. Like, let's say you're launching a data center, you need to procure certain hardware. So this needs to go into procurement management. So who is responsible, where the money come from, when this is done. So this not always relevant, but important to know that it's a separate part of the project plan. The main project management plan, that's basically a document that describes how the project is executed, monitored, and references all the other separate plans normally. Quality management plan is a way for the project to ensure that everything that's being done, that everything that's changed is conforming to the policies, procedures, and guidelines, and also objectives that we achieve are complying with certain quality requirements. So we need to define these quality requirements and make sure we capture how we meet these quality requirements for the, let's say, a process. We define a process. How do we know that it's good enough for the project consumer, project customer to use? So this is important to capture, not always captured, but quite often communicated within the project, because without knowing how to get certain quality of the change, we don't know how to finish the project. So it's always either implied or explicitly stated within the quality management plan. Release plan basically defines dates and deliverables that are delivered during these dates, what is being delivered and what are expectations for every deliverable. I haven't used it honestly, so I cannot say it's commonly used, but good to know, especially when you're planning multiple deliverables, good to at least define a list of these deliverables, when they expect it, and what is the expected state of these deliverables. Requirements management is important because once you capture requirements during project charter or initial project plan, it's important to regularly revisit these requirements and make sure that anything that changes in the requirements is captured, like this end date of the project delivery. It's a requirement, like sponsor has a requirement to deliver a project by early December. If after negotiations with the stakeholder, with the sponsor, executive sponsor, due date of the project is changed to the end of December, then this needs to go to the requirements, to the list of requirements, and how this is captured within requirements is detailed in the requirements management plan. Again, not always existing as a separate management plan, but good to know and very useful actually, if it's a bigger project especially. Resource management is essentially detailing how to receive appropriate people for the project or materials, and how to make sure they are continuing to work and then be engaged with the project. Because quite often project manager doesn't have control over this, but when project manager has this control, it's important to know how these people and materials are received, assigned to tasks, allocated, and also important how to monitor the people, how they're working, and to control use of these resources, basically of people and materials. And finally, risk management plan. It's basically details how to deal with risks captured within risks register, or more globally, some global risks. Generally, they should be in risk register, but if they are not, still they should be managed according to this plan. Basically, what if we cannot meet the plan due date end of December? What do we do in that case? It's important to write down actions or plan before the project is started. I mean, it's possible to be done during the project execution, but important to capture it before. There is also scope management, basically to ensure there is no scope creep or any items within scope that are no longer relevant, how to descope them. So that's basically ensuring the project keeps on track and how this is done. Schedule management is very important, and it's around making sure the dates are met when project is planned, that estimations that are done there, they should be accurate, and during execution that dates and schedule is met. There are several techniques how to do that, but in the end it requires basically schedule planning skill, and a lot of it comes from experience. Stakeholder engagement plan is essentially a plan on how to work with each stakeholder, and quite often this plan is not shared with the global project team, since there can be some individual information or sensitive information, like how to work with the sponsor or how to work with regular project team members. So that's information usually known to the project manager and maybe to the project sponsor. Sometimes even project sponsor has no view into this stakeholder engagement plan. And here in the PMBOK, they propose a test plan. Basically, it's a way to have a sort of a template for the plan document that describes everything and helps set a structure for the overall project document. There are also documentation, additional miscellaneous artifacts such as hierarchy charts. That's basically organizational charts, breakdown of the resources of products, risk breakdown, work breakdown structure. And work breakdown structure is quite important. It's basically what a lot of people commonly refer to as a project plan, which is it's not. It's a work breakdown structure listing tasks and amount of work or time needed for each task and resources associated with this with specific work. And individual work units, they are captured in this chart. There can be various ways to represent it, but often it's represented as a Gantt chart, if you heard this term. So that's important item for the project, and this is what, let's say, RIKE tool helps define, basically define this work breakdown structure, define the tasks for the project. Baselines, it's another list of artifacts within project artifact delivery, and they help measure all the important project criteria against certain levels, let's say budget levels, milestone schedule. Performance measurement baseline is very equally important. Essentially, how are we doing against reaching the schedule goal or scope goal or cost goal. And the project schedule is essentially the list of milestones, list of tasks and dates, durations of each task. So this is sort of related to work breakdown structure, the project schedule. Scope baseline, it's self-explanatory, basically measurement against a list of items that we want to achieve during this project execution. And there is a miscellaneous visual data information that's, I've never used them too much. Affinity diagram, burn down chart, cause and effect diagram. These are all not necessary items, but they can be useful visual aids for the project manager, especially when communicating with project stakeholders around project delivery. So there's a lot of types of visual aids and diagrams that can support project delivery. And finally, reports. Basically, reports can be three main ones. It's a quality report, basically quality measurement detection. Risk report, overview of the project risks and changes to them. And status report. Status report basically defines current state of the project, changes and progress since the previous status report. Potential also forecasts for the next period before next status report.
How often is usually status report presented? Is it like weekly?
Depends on the project. Depends on the project. In most common projects, it's weekly indeed. When it's not too engaging and it's not very slow project, usually it's weekly. I've had projects where you had to do daily status reports, and I have projects that are requiring monthly status reports. They're not requiring weekly ones. Really depends on the project.
Do you have any example of a status report for a project?
Not off the top of my head, not also in front of my desk, so I can look for some sample later. Let me take a note.
Yes, please, if this is possible, because
yes,
this is
it's possible.
Most great. Thank you so much, because this is one of the most common deliverables from myself to the project sponsors that's required. So I do use PowerPoint with a few kind of major points for each project, because usually we have a few projects in parallel that are being worked on. So it's challenging for me to understand first what's the format, second how to organize it. Is probably it's better in some kind of a shared space where I just publish some weekly updates, but what's the format? Is it PowerPoint, or there's a better way? And then also what key points to enter there, kind of what's considered important. Kind of I'm a little bit challenged with this one.
As for formatting, I won't give any specific examples, but I will give examples of a structure, what goes into status report. As for PowerPoint, it's a very good tool to use. You can actually use, let's say, online SharePoint location, like Office 365 PowerPoint. And this way you can update regularly in certain space regular status reports in a PowerPoint format, and just share the link to this PowerPoint with all the relevant stakeholders, especially to sponsors and executive sponsor. Quick note, you can have several status updates depending on the audience. Basically, if you want to have separate status report just for the sponsors, for the executive representation, you can have separate report for them. It requires more work, but might be necessary if the groups are not overlined, they're not overlapping. I mean, if groups have different knowledge base, basically there are more technical people and there are executive officers, and you might want to share different types of information with these people. That's up to a project manager basically to decide. So it might be possible to have several reports. It's a normal practice basically. Easier to have a single one, but if it might require separate presentations on status report. As for the structure, I'll give specific examples, but basically you mean to add what's the current status of the project, and usually it's comparison to the project goals, like you have certain goals and how is the project measuring against these goals, what was the progress since last status report, and define next steps or plans for the next reporting period within the project. So usually this is sufficient. More specifically structure, I'll try to share.
Okay.
Okay, I can quickly glance on other artifacts. There is artifacts within the project that are around agreements, contracts, and everything. Not very common in all the projects, but happens sometimes. Sometimes project manager is involved in contract negotiations, reporting time and materials, doing report cards. So yeah, this requires certain, let's say, legal assistance for this. So project might have legal branching into agreements and contracts. And finally, there are other artifacts such as activity list, basically a list of tasks that are being executed with some schedule and details. Bidding data, I don't think it's very relevant. It's usually with federal contractors or some open contracting market where certain customer issues bid and several contractors participate in this bid. So that there could be discussion around this, but quite often it's within sales organization, not within project organization. But you never know, possible. Metrics is basically how to measure separate items of the project. Project calendar is essentially an easier overview of work breakdown structure and project schedule. And specific requirements documentation might have just separate document listing requirements for the project. And project team charter is also optional. It's basically to keep track, not of all the stakeholders, but just of the project team. And final here, user story, it's more specific to software development, not necessarily, but more specific when you capture certain use cases and user stories to basically use as a basis for developing a process, software, or some change within an organization. So that's about it.
Quite a big document and a lot of artifacts. I'm using just a handful. But
in reality, to summarize, I've usually used only several of them. I've used project charter, I've used business case, I've used project management plan, which had several sections for project communication, risk management, quality control, quality management, and assumptions log. So they can be separate documents, they can be a single document. It's not a rule to have everything separate, it's just easier to manage that way. Also important to have proper archival procedures, basically when you're done with the project, how to store the project information. Normally, if you're doing, let's say, Confluence, you just keep it where it is and maybe mark it as archived for the future reference, basically. When you're doing next project, it's often good idea to reuse structure when it's especially identical project, to reuse structure of the documents and maybe some templated format of the documentation. So out of everything in this list, I've used really a handful of documents in most cases.
Okay, so that's a good news, because if really as a project manager one day I have to create almost all of these documents, it sounds very overwhelming, kind of, instead of working on the project itself and communicating with people and tracking, like creating tasks and so on, you keep yourself too much busy with tracking, which is also not nice.
And that's why there is a project manager. Project manager can decide what is needed, unless told so from project sponsor, hire manager. So project manager can decide what is needed, what is relevant, to make basically an educated decision on what information to keep, what information to track, as long as this project manager knows what he or she is doing. So yeah, it's all a recommendation. All of this is a recommendation. It's not set in stone. It's not absolute requirement. So no need to be formal about approach of this. You should capture no more and no less than needed information.
And what about delegating tasks? Do I, as a project manager, need to really be the single owner of every task? Because I find myself too much like putting on my shoulders like too much work, because even after the project is launched or during the project launch, instead of the managers of the teams, I do the access requests and all that arrangements for every team member. And even after the project is live and it's been a month or two since we went live, I still somehow, they send me, oh, this is a new team member, please provide this access, provide that access. So I feel like I'm not very, I'm not delegating anything to anyone, and I keep everything on myself, which is too much sometimes.
Yeah, that's both a personal and organizational problem. Sometimes people are not comfortable delegating, and that's understandable. But also it could be an organizational problem where organization is not basically encouraging delegation of such tasks that are not really directly project manager's responsibility. So if possible, yes, I would advise delegating anything that's not crucial or that requires a lot of time, that's not part of the project management, to available team members. But if they're not available, what can you do? That's basically being organizational problem. If possible, yes, I would definitely delegate, especially mundane activities such as managing access or managing like introducing people to the project, let's say. If there is a possibility to have, let's say, right hand that can walk new people through the project details, that helps a lot, if possible again.
Yeah, I would need to think about this. Maybe I will just create some guidance for the managers and we'll send a global communication to the involved managers to, from now on for this project, you are responsible to manage the accesses and the issues of your
team. Yeah, and important to keep when such communication is issued. First of all, you need to make sure that it's known how this is tracked, because if you're delegating to somebody, even if it's manager or some other team, how to track it, how to make sure this is done. So that's part of the documenting decisions and basically documenting management of stakeholders and changes. So if this is documented, everybody agrees, then somebody cannot say, oh, we weren't told. So it's documented, you agreed to that. There is a track record to prove. That's why it's important, especially in formalized environments. Also, you should remember that project manager is not really limited to anything. If possible, project manager can do pretty much anything needed to execute the project. So if necessary, you can always discuss with the manager or go directly to the resources and see if some tasks can be handled by certain additional people, provided you have this authority. So whatever is needed to execute the project manager is capable of doing that, as long as it's not limited by company policies.
Right. Yeah, and that I feel so heavily right now, because kind of like everyone is looking at me, like all kinds of managers, countries and all types of, I don't know. It's just like everyone, when it's found that there's some tasks to be executed related to the project or the post go live date, like the initiative is always not taken by anyone else, even if they are the competent people, but they're waiting for me to do the action, to ask someone to organize, to do myself or something like that. So I feel like
and that's the role of project manager, basically being go-to authority for a certain project, especially when people are not certain who is responsible for it. And to simplify that, project manager would define policies and responsibilities around certain areas, like who is responsible for post-go live. It's quite possible that project manager might assign a group of people, if it's permitted by company policy, to basically take care of post-live maintenance of the system. And that would, yeah. Go ahead.
How long is the post-live care usually?
It's very individual. It's very individual. I mean, it can be anywhere between 0 and years. So it depends really on the project. You cannot. I cannot say that. It's. I've had projects where post-live was a couple of days, and I've had projects where post-live was literally years. like 3-4 years, especially if it's not properly documented in terms of, let's say, contract, how long the post-life duration is captured. In some major projects, like that were actual changes delivered to customers, it was explicitly stated in a contract, let's say 1 month after live, that project team provides assistance to the support team, to the customer team for the project deliverables. That can be explicitly stated in the contract. If it's something is not documented and not agreed upon by every stakeholder or relevant stakeholder, then it's very hard to influence. Therefore, that's again job of project manager to document and make sure all the agreements are captured and agreed upon.
Right. Okay. So a big challenge for me because yeah, documenting is not my power and reporting is not my biggest power. I'm multitasker, I'm very proactive. I'm negotiating well with people and having good relationships and all that when it comes to documenting, formalizing.
That's the thing. That's the thing. And I mean, I've rarely seen people enjoying documentation. I mean, that's let's say that's pretty mundane task in reality. I mean,
yeah.
Writing down everything and structuring, it takes a special set of mind to really enjoy it. But it's very important for the success of a project and for the sanity of the project manager to keep everything documented and ordered, and everybody aware of the project state and changes and agreements, especially agreements made during the project execution.
But do we sign like formal agreements, or is it just email communication? Like
it really depends. Depends on the nature of the project. Depends on the environment of the project. In some cases, yes, it requires formal sign-off, like full change committee meeting that has negotiations and agreements being captured and recorded officially, and then everybody who's having key stake in this they have to sign off officially. It can be even some electronic or physical signature in that case. In some cases, email is enough. I mean, really very much depends on environment. I've had all sorts of ways of capturing the agreements and sign off, but having at least some paper track like email or document where a person states this is very important, because if it's just a conversation, might as well never happen.
Yeah, that's the case in most of the cases with my projects. Like it's so dynamic, like every day a new decision, every day a new solution, every day a new risk. And like we discuss like on the daily meetings, okay, yeah, got it. Sometimes I send a recap of the meeting, like it means if no one objected, then I captured as it is and everyone agrees. But in many cases, it's just like, okay, it's a conversation on the chat, on the Teams call, and then no recording of that. Yeah, and this is maybe something I have to fix. Okay.
I think you should pick this up. Yeah, well, basically, whenever there is a meeting and there is discussion, if a project manager, the person who is leading the call, the meeting, if it's online, you can, let's say, have a Confluence page in editing mode or OneNote document open, directly shared with everyone. Everybody sees. You write down all the decisions, all the agreements, and in the end, you just send out this recap as it is, as captured during the call. That simplifies time management. Basically, project manager doesn't need to spend double time capturing these changes post meeting. And that also helps everybody to see what is being actually discussed and captured, and the same information is being shared afterwards. So nobody can say, yes, and I mean, I didn't agree to that, or I didn't say yes to this, because that was on the call, everybody agreed. And if somebody disagrees, they can always respond saying, no, I don't think that that's what I agreed to. So very important to capture everything online while discussion is happening. Sometimes it's not possible, but whenever possible, it's a very good idea to do so. It's removes some time for the project manager. It's just, otherwise it's double work.
Right.
That really is
Okay,
all
Super.
I have for today. Yeah. So for next meeting, I'll think about some additional topics. And if you have some asks, yes, please ask. I'll try to think about some appropriate
Definitely
topics.
stakeholder management is my biggest challenge so far, I think, apart from, besides this documentation, which, but then, the stakeholder management, I think is the key, because there are departments and certain people that are hard to work with, are not cooperative, reject meetings, don't want to meet, don't want to discuss, don't want to approve.
Okay. Yeah, it's a very common problem, and I can totally relate. I can basically build next sort of a learning course on project management around practical aspects of stakeholder management. So yeah.
That would be awesome.
Okay. Stop recording.